In our earliest records of economic thinking, household consumption was the focus. In Greek, the term actually means household management. Most production occurred on large estates with slave labor, but the focus was on producing for the consumption needs of the estate itself. This emphasis held in the main until the Industrial Revolution, at which point attention turned to production. This was understandable given the huge transformation caused by technologically driven improvements to productivity and the resulting societal reordering. It's not called a revolution for nothing. How were people to understand and manage such an explosion in productive capacity? This focus on production was further entrenched by Karl Marx's framing of the long arc of history in terms of production processes described by the relationship of labor to capital and the ensuing capitalist versus communist contest driving most of the 20th century geopolitics. The result is that consumption-oriented perspectives in standard economics are relatively paltry, despite the implicit modern doctrine of consumer sovereignty. We're going to skip over relative, absolute, or life cycle income theories and marginal propensities to consume and look to 6 complexity-oriented considerations of consumption. The first is that consumption norms are cultural. In 1994, photojournalist Peter Menzel produced a book titled Material World, A Global Family Portrait, in which he and 15 other photographers traveled to 30 countries and lived for a week with economically average families. At the end of each visit, the photographer and family produced a portrait of the family members outside their home surrounded by all their possessions. Here we meet the Kavan family from California, the Yukita family from Tokyo, and the Abdullah family from Kuwait City. Hazel Kirk derived a theory of consumption based on standard of livings, what she'd been calling target incomes. Hazel Kirk derived a theory of consumption based on standard of livings, what we've been calling target incomes. She saw neoclassical economic theory as promoting the maximization of production, and that applying the same profit maximization logic to household utility maximization ran counter to all available evidence of household consumption behavior. She described how households have a standard of living in accord with their social status and will have some abundance beyond what they need to meet that standard of living. In a developing economy, that abundance invites the production of new goods and services which absorb that abundance, thus creating the standard of living, and so on in an ongoing cycle. Household consumption is comparative. Post-industrial families used to spend according to what others in their reference group spent, which is in accord with Kirk's standard of livings, and would attempt to keep consumption in line with their neighbors. This changed in the 1980s when families shifted their behavior to spend according to an aspirational group rather than in line with neighbors. If you're thinking lifestyles of the rich and famous, in fact, TV watching has been correlated with spending. And while 1950s TV programming depicted middle-class family life, today's TV programming is dominated by depiction of upper-class families. Here's the house from My Three Sons, a 1960s sitcom. And here's the house from Brothers and Sisters from 2006. Consumption today is different from what it was pre-industrial revolution. The large-scale immigration from rural communities to urban centers fundamentally reordered society. Pre-revolution, families made consumption decisions based on target incomes and had a high regard for leisure time. Post-revolution, producers demanded more labor and incentivized workers with various sticks and carrots to increase working hours. Somehow this translated into workers working to consume rather than to make a standard living, and consumption started tracking with income. A possible mechanism for this shift was that consumption was a psychological replacement for the social ties lost in the move away from rooted communities. Remember Aristotle's limiting principle for consumption. An individual could only consume so much, so there was an expected diminishing return on production. Here, the concept is reframed as Engels' law, where as income increases, the percentage spent on food decreases. In the 1940s, consumer credit became a thing, thus further encouraging household consumption. The servicing of household debt is an increasingly significant component of monthly household expenses. It's interesting to think about what this means for target incomes, which need to rise accordingly to meet all expenses, including debt obligations. Here's a graph from Fred, which you should definitely know about and explore. It's a database at the St. Louis Federal Reserve. The graph shows the increase in consumer loans from commercial banks from the 1950s to summer 2023. Consumer loans are credit card and other revolving loans, such as overdraft balances. In August of 2023, American household credit card debt surpassed $1 trillion. We'll come back to debt later in this course. Consumption can be exogenously generated. In your reading is a mid-century short story by J.G. Ballard about the purposeful generation of demand. One of the tactics described is planned obsolescence, where the patterns in the road are intentionally changed so that commuters have to buy new tires. Obsolescence can manifest in three ways. The first is functional obsolescence, which means that technological improvements and innovations make a later product superior to an earlier product, thus rendering the earlier product obsolete. Functional obsolescence doesn't need to be planned, but in many cases it is planned. Think iPhones or operating systems. A related manifestation of obsolescence is desirability obsolescence, when an item becomes obsolete because something else becomes more desirable as a matter of taste and preference, not necessarily as a matter of function. There are industries devoted to changing fashions, thus there is an element of planning here as well. The first overt instance of this is the mid-century rollout of yearly car models. The last form is quality obsolescence, where items are manufactured with a specific, likely short lifetime. It becomes cheaper to discard your $20 toaster and buy a new one than repair yours if a knob breaks. Designers such as George Nelson argue that planned obsolescence was an important driver of innovation. From the above, we see the inherently social aspect of consumption patterns, and those patterns in turn determine the social context in the coevolutionary process. The next two considerations are more academic. Consumption discourse is framed in terms of capitalistic production, thus making it challenging to capture non-formal production such as home or community production in any meaningful way. The intellectual tendency is instead to frame all human activity in terms of material production and consumption, though clearly much of human activity is neither. This leads to contortions such as children consuming education or ill persons consuming healthcare. The late David Graeber continually made the point that the purpose of society is to produce fully actualized people embedded in meaningful social relationships, and that material production is only a component of that endeavor. Finally, from a systems perspective, it is clear that most material production is indeed ultimately intended for household consumption. Thus, whatever is produced should be used up in consumption in order to balance the cycle and close the circuit. As the mere process of production, consumption is grossly under-theorized. First, production and consumption cycles are coupled through wages, whereby households need to provide labor to production in order to obtain wages to consume what they in turn work to produce. Second, increasing consumption is indeed tied to all economic growth paradigms, which suggest questions of resource constraint and sustainability, which we'll come back to.